and the title that I could refer to you.
So my name is Ted Rutland, and I'm an associate professor at Concordia University.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So what does it mean for the city to reward the police for overspending and, I guess, the last few years, I know it's been going on for a while, but still have the SPVM continue to overspend the budget?
I think it shows how little the current administration cares about police overspending and cares how little it cares about what Montreal residents actually want. And so if you look across Canada, Montreal is the only police department that overspends to this extent. The SPVM overspends by about $30 million a year. That's basically them deciding what they feel like spending, how much of our money they would like to spend. No other police force does this. The closest other examples are Vancouver and Peel region that overspend by about $2.5 million a year, which is like a very, very small amount. So this is year after year that this happens. And, the responsibility for that lies with the SPVM, of course, but it also lies with the municipal government that's supposed to oversee the police. There have been issues of overspending at other police forces in the past, but city councils have acted and it basically explained that, we decide your budget in this kind of pseudo-democratic way. You need to respect your budget like all the other services and offices of the city do. So that's one thing. And then the other is, since 2020, there's been a lot more attention on police spending. The slogan of defunding the police and reinvesting in communities has really pointed towards a different way of thinking about public safety. And it's not about, just taking money away from the police or making cops, more stressed out, giving them less time to do their work. It's about reallocating resources and reallocating responsibilities for public safety. It's about saying we can do a whole bunch of things to keep ourselves safe, to reduce violence, for example, to better respond to issues related to homelessness, mental illness, drugs, etc. And if we make those investments, then we don't need the police as much. And maybe we don't need, maybe one day we don't need the police at all. But it's really articulating a very different way of thinking about safety that would reduce the harms committed by the police, as well as better deal with the root causes of violence and other forms of harm in our communities. And when we see that Montreal, the Montreal city government, has increased the police budget more than any other city in Canada since 2020, you start to think that these people do not listen to residents. They don't care about the demands that were made by Black Lives Matter activists and their allies in 2020. They think that they can just sort of pursue the same old agenda. And in fact, they've increased the rate of budget increases in Montreal since 2020. So rather than obviously like reallocating police funding, they've given more money to the police. It just shows how little they're actually listening to people, how little accountable they are to everyday Montrealers, and especially those who are harmed by the police in a systemic way.
So when you bring up reallocating money in the budget, I was reading that $10 million has been dedicated to EMIS and okay, I didn't write this down, but I believe this is coming from the $25 million being allocated from the provincial government over. Sorry, I thought I wrote that down. I want to say over like 3 to 5 years.
200, so from the province, it's $250 million over 5 years. So $50 million a year. $45 million is going straight to the police, and $5 million goes to IMIS. So when we see that the budget for IMIS is $10 million for 2023, half of that comes from the province and half of it comes from the city.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying. And from that, I want to ask, for people saying, oh, well, the city is taking some of that money that is, I guess, allocated from the provincial government to be put towards reducing crime. would you say that's enough? Like, how much further should they go?
Um, the line of Projet Montréal since the summer of 2020 has been that we don't need to defund the police to reinvest in communities. We want to seek a balance. We want to invest in the police, and we also want to invest in communities. And there's a couple of problems with that. One is that's exactly the line of the police brotherhoods across the country. I mean, they're very strategic people. They knew in the summer of 2020 that they can't just say nothing needs to change. And so police organizations across the country came out with this line that we should continue to increase police budgets, but absolutely we need to deal with the social roots of violence. We need to invest in social programs, etc. So it's a little bit weird that police brotherhoods that are only accountable to police officers have the same messaging as a municipal government that's supposed to be accountable to all city residents. But the other thing is that there is no equilibrium between investment in policing and investment in community prevention in this current budget. We're talking about a $63 million increase for the police and a $10 million budget total for EMIS. And that's a very little of that new money is coming from the city itself. What I would say with EMIS is that we need to have a kind of interesting and open kind of discussion about it, because it is a model that we've seen in other cities that can do a great deal of good, where you're diverting a certain number of start that over again. It's a model that's shown to be promising in other cities, where you have civilians with certain kinds of training in mental health care, in public health, in community work, dealing with situations that normally the police would be called to deal with. And the potential for that kind of civilian response is enormous. Our current police director, the new police director, Fadi Deguerre, says that around 70 or 80% of 911 calls have nothing to do with criminality, have nothing to do with law and order. They're calls for social service. And what he's saying is confirmed by studies all over the place. So the easiest way to defund the police and reinvest in communities would be to shift 911 calls, a large number of them, to squads that are composed of civilians like EMIS. That's the easiest thing we could do. It's not enough, but it would be easy. The problem with EMIS is that it was created without any kind of community consultation. It was not created with any input from organizations that work with homeless people, that are accountable to homeless people, and yet this is a team that deals predominantly with homeless people. And so what people on the ground are saying is that the EMIS team is like another layer of police. I mean, they don't have guns and they don't have the power to arrest. So I'm sure we could admit that this is better than the police, but they're also not there to help in the same way and support people and accompany people in the same way that community organizations that work with homeless people are. So even there, we see like a small positive step towards something different, but another case where the city is not listening to residents. They're not listening to organizations that have the best knowledge of what is needed on the ground. And so, we're not in a situation now where I think we could even demand that money be shifted from the SPVM to EMIS, because EMIS isn't functioning the way it should. And so, again, we just really need this administration to wake up and listen and be willing to, do something that actually changes something, rather than just saying things like, oh, we believe in an equilibrium between investment in police and investment in community, when that's false. And when even behind that slogan, we see that what they call the community isn't really the community either.
Thank you.
I can repeat any amount of that into a soundbite kind of thing. That was a long-winded, kind of jumbled answer.
No. It was good. I was actually thinking of parts that I think are really successful for me to use. So yeah, I'll keep that in mind though. But thank you.
Okay.
What kind of legacy does ballooning the police budget year after year leave for Projet Montréal?
I think it's really interesting that that as much as we could criticize the previous administration led by Denis Coderre, they did not increase the police budget very much. And in at least 1 year, they decreased the budget. And so, like, if your vision of reducing the harms committed by the police involves defunding the police and funding other kinds of community safety, we were actually in a better position under the Cloutier administration to be able to try to bring that about. When Projet Montréal, voted their first budget in 2020, they voted a $14 million increase to the police budget. Activists and the community in general, I think, was hoping for defunding the police. And so already there, we were $14 million behind. Instead of getting the defunding, we now had to reverse that increase and then work on defunding. 2 years later, they've increased the budget by $45 million and now $63 million. And so we're looking at $100 million that they've added to the annual police budget, not counting the amount that the police allocates to itself by overspending. And so the challenge becomes, it's huge. Just to get back to where we were in 2020, we need to defund the police by $100 million. And, that would take some bravery on the part of the city administration to say, we're going to cut $100 million out of the police budget. But that's what we would need just to get back to the status quo, let alone to start really chipping away at the power and scope of the police in Montreal. Again, not to leave cop stress out or leave actual public safety issues unaddressed, but to begin to approach those public safety issues in a different way. So every year we get further and further behind with this government.
Thank you. Is there something to be said, or I guess any thoughts that you have about the overtime being that, or pardon me, the overspending being that police are doing all this overtime?
I think one of the things here, we've seen in the budget deliberations, there have been citizens asking, how do you explain this? And what are you going to do about this? And both the head of the SPVM and the people responsible for public security with Projet Montréal have said, well, there's been a lot of crime this year and there was COVID. And it's like they can't look beyond their own noses, right? There have been increases in certain kinds of crime in cities across Canada, and we don't have that level of overspending. COVID, as far as I can understand, is not a Montreal-specific pandemic. I'm pretty sure that it exists in other cities too. And so there's never been an ability on the part of either the SPVM or Projet Montréal to actually explain why this, to provide any kind of explanation for why this happens. They keep basically assuming that we have no idea what happens outside Montreal, and so we'll just accept that, oh, there's a pandemic and there's been some certain kinds of crime, so obviously it's fine for the police to overspend by this year $50 million.
Yeah, that is a funny point. It's so silly. So in the budget, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, nothing.
Okay. In the budget, Valerie Plante said, it's translated, but something along the lines of Montreal is recognized as one of the safest metropolises in America, and the budget includes several measures to support the work of what our police officers are doing. I know you discussed, or we discussed the whole part about public safety before, but, what do you think about this statement about Montreal being recognized as one of the safest cities in North America, in comparison to, reports in the media and also statements by Projet Montréal themselves saying that, Montreal is becoming so much more dangerous, and the police and funding the police is a way that we can, combat this increasing, risk towards our public security.
I think it's really interesting to see the way that police messaging has shifted from 2020 until now. And so beginning in late 2019, but continuing through 2020, 2021, we see the police exaggerating the extent of gun violence in the city. They release selected figures about gun crime to the public that show that there are increases in certain categories of gun crime. And I have no reason to doubt those categories, but they also hold back the kinds of gun crime that are decreasing. And so overall gun crime was decreasing through 2021. It increased, about 3% for 2022. So very marginal increases. And then about 2 weeks ago, the SPVM releases data for 2022 that shows that gun crime is decreasing. And so now they're deciding that the story that we need to hear is that they've been very successful in combating gun crime. But again, they don't release all the data. So we don't actually know whether gun crime is decreasing or increasing because they've released the data that supports the narrative that they want. But we can speculate about why, during a budget deliberation, they would want to now say that they're doing a good job. And so then the narrative becomes we're a really safe city and we need to keep it that way. But I mean, the broader thing, and this is where I think Valérie Plante's comments are always off the mark, is that she will say things like, Montreal is one of the safest cities in North America, and we need to keep it that way. That's why we're funding the police. And it's like, well, yes, Montreal is one of the safest cities in North America, but that's not because of the police. Public safety depends on all kinds of things. It depends on like good public schools. It depends on community programs. It depends on sports programs that like offer mentorship to youth. It depends on whether people have access to decent jobs. It depends on all kinds of things. And so to say that the level of public safety that we have in Montreal is a function of police, and we need to continually increase the police budget in order to keep Montreal safe, just shows that they actually don't really understand public safety at all. And I think that that's been a real problem with this administration, is that they continually defer to the SPVM for all guidance about how to deal with public safety. And they're not even necessarily an expert on policing the police, but the police, at best, are a very small part of an overall set of social relations and institutions that produce public safety. And so ideally, you'd want a government that understands, policing, but also all the other things that contribute to public safety. But if you just defer to the SPVM as your expert on public safety, then you're always going to get a very, very narrow perspective on these issues. And the answer to public safety issues is always going to be more police. I wouldn't expect the SPVM to say anything more, I would expect that, the president of Concordia would say that the best way to improve public safety is to invest in higher education. Like, that's the job of the head of a university. So I don't blame them for that. I blame the administration for not being able to take a broader perspective on these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I guess I don't have much more to ask, but I guess a couple things. There's been some optimism towards the new police chief. Do you have any specific thoughts you want to share on him?
I think that Fadi Deguerre is a talented police director. He's a smart guy. He's a person who likes to leave his mark on institutions that he is responsible for. Like he likes to innovate. I think he's a good leader. He wins the support of the troops. So all of these things are really helpful. But again, we have this problem where everyone sort of sees him as someone who's going to transform policing and address these problems that we experience in our communities: racial profiling, social profiling, and police violence. But he works for us. And the way that a police chief can be accountable to the population is through the city government. And so we cannot expect him to transform the police. He has to be given really clear, sort of broad directions from the city government. And if the city government does that, then things could start to improve. So, for example, in Longueuil, under his leadership, under Daguerre's leadership, they were seeking to hire 200 cops to work as community workers in the community, and the public's going to pay for that. And I think that Montrealers kind of understand that if what we need are community workers, then maybe we should just hire community workers, not hire police to do something that they're not at all trained for. So if we don't give him clear directions, there's a risk that he'll do that here. On the other hand, he said upon taking the reins of the SPVM that 70 to 80% of 911 calls have nothing to do with criminality. They're calls for social service, and community groups are a better place to respond to those calls than the police. So now there's an opportunity. he understands that the police are not the solution to all problems. He understands that the police are not the best response to even the majority of 911 calls. And so if we have a city government that can say, listen, Mr. Daguerre, we would like you to be a partner in this transformation that we'd like to bring about. We're going to create and fund a non-police emergency response team, and we're going to work to have more and more 911 calls diverted to that team. Fadi Daguerre would obviously understand the importance of that, and he's a smart enough person and a good enough leader that he could play a meaningful role in bringing about that change. And so once again, I really think that he's a fine police chief, but if we expect him by himself to transform the police, then we're going to be gravely disappointed. We need everyday citizens, community groups, activist groups to put pressure on the city, and we need the city to give clear directions to Fadi Daguerre about what kinds of changes we would like him to implement.
Thank you. On the note of putting more pressure on the city to make these changes, I mean, alongside elaborating a bit more on that, what else can we do to change this system, especially, if this budget is passed in, whatever the date is?
Right. Yeah, good question. I mean, I think that what the answer to any big social or environmental issue is for people to get involved. And if people are not involved in any kind of like social or ecological justice cause, and they have the time, I think that people need to get involved in those things. And, there are many organizations that are working to defund the police and reinvest in communities. The Defund the Police Coalition is one organization that has 80 member groups, and they're always looking for people to get involved. But on the side of that, if people are already involved in things, it's not necessary to switch to thinking about defunding the police. It's a matter of bringing these kinds of issues into the work that you do. And so policing is relevant to any issue that people are already working on. And the existing groups that you're part of might be a great way to kind of do some popular education around these things, and then just, participate in protests, respond to calls to action, include a vision of transforming public safety in the vision of the transformation that you want to have. And other groups can do the same with the issues that you're working on. And so, yeah, I think that we just need to be ready to integrate this issue into our organizing over the long term, because this transformation will occur. It just might take a while. There's no future in the system that we have right now. And so, like so many issues that we're facing right now, the next 10 or 20 years will determine whether like these issues get addressed or whether we just descend into a kind of like a climate chaos and far right apocalypse. So, short-term things are disappointing, but we knew this struggle was going to be a long-term one. And it's a struggle, around the core aspects of the way that our society is organized. We have a state that is less and less responsible to people. We have power consolidating in the most authoritarian institutions, from corporations to police to military. And if we're going to, make the world better and, maintain some kind of social existence beyond 20 or 30 years from now, that's a power struggle more than just a policy struggle. We know mostly what we need to do, but implementing those kinds of changes requires requires a confrontation with those who are invested in the status quo.
I'm hesitant to ask this because it might be a bit too anarchist. And I don't know if it would maybe just be you repeating what you just said, but like when you discuss working within the system we have and how that is a difficulty, I mean, does it just require removing the whole system? Like if we're either choosing between, liberal politicians who keep funding the system and then, Denis Coderre who, there's, I'm not going to go into that, but like
Mhm.
I don't know. I guess I'm trying to ask, do you have much faith that we can really make a change within the system, or do we have to kind of look at the way our society operates and kind of how do I word this? Disassemble so much more than the way we fund things in our society. I don't know if that's too big a question.
I think it's huge, but I mean, I think that on these issues, I take my guidance to from a long history of abolitionists, from that long history that extends from the movement to abolish slavery through the movement to abolish prisons, police, surveillance, prison industrial complex. Most of those people that I look to in that struggle are Black and Indigenous people, mostly Black women and transgender folks. And I think some of the works that have been really helpful for thinking about that lately have been from Robert Maynard, Leanne Simpson, Andrea Ritchie, Miriam Kaba. And I think all of them sort of provide a kind of similar way of thinking about things, which is that we can't change this just by changing the way that the state operates. We need to, for example, learn how to better take care of each other in our communities. We need to, ultimately not call some kind of other state agency to respond to social situations, a state agency that maybe is not armed and not a police, but we need to take more and more responsibility for the safety of each other. That's got to be part of it. At the same time, I do think that we need to engage with the city and with other levels of the state and try to transform them because they control an immense amount of resources. And so I don't think that we can have a struggle where we're just figuring out how to take care of each other and have nothing to say about the fact that $800 million of our money is being given to an institution that's completely unaccountable to the public and consistently harms the most vulnerable parts of our communities. And I do believe, perhaps naively, that it's possible to have an actual left-wing politics in city government. We don't have that right now. People keep telling me that there are progressive members of Projet Montréal, and maybe that's true, but the condition of them being part of the party is that they can't speak up about anything. So I'm not sure what difference it makes ultimately. I think it would be really helpful. It's not where I'm going to put a lot of my effort, but I do think it's very possible to see, a left-wing municipal party that maybe doesn't even claim power, but that exerts an influence. And I think that kind of work, engaging with the state, trying to wrest some control over the resources that are our resources and that it deploys in ways that are counter to our interests is really important. At the same time, that we shouldn't kind of pretend that that's ever going to be the entirety of the struggle, and we need to figure out how to support each other economically, and support the natural world around us, provide safety for each other in ways that are independent of the state. I think we need to be doing both things at the same time.
Thank you for answering that. I know that was that was a big question. I really appreciate it.
It's a good one,
Is
though.
there
It's a good
anything that
one.
I? Yeah, I know that
Nope.
out of other people I'd interview, you would give me an answer for that. um, okay, yeah.
Probably
If
not that
there's anything
Bitcoin.
else, if there's anything else you think of, don't hesitate to reach out, and yeah, I'll be in touch if I get any response about when the budget's gonna be in.